that actually ties in perfectly with this documentary is going, and Derek Bell and his argument that that Brown versus Board of Education was a failure because it focused more on the separate and not enough on the equal. Just in general, when you hear that argument, what is your initial response?
Well, my initial response is back to this idea of power and then this conceptual reality when we talk about issues of equality. If the issue is not the accommodations and we remedy the accommodations, then we still are left with the same problems. Nowadays, we might have a Trayvon Martin, Eric Garner. We might have 20 to 30 schools being closed in the city of Philadelphia while they build a $400 million prison facility in Pennsylvania. So somebody can argue, well, the accommodations are equal. And somebody else could say, well, that wasn't the primary problem. That was a manifestation of a larger issue. The larger issue was racism and racial terror and not recognizing people as full human beings. And if I give you a nice building but I don't recognize you as a full human being, your nice building could in 2017 very well just be a prison. You can have superior accommodations. You can have a brand new prison while I live in an old suburb. So accommodations are irrelevant in that context. Which one would you prefer? A brand new prison bed or an old suburb? Most people say the old suburb. So we're not talking about accommodations, we're talking about power. I think black people in the civil rights era were pretty focused on what the real issues were, but some of the leadership got a little too caught up in the symbolism and the accommodations.
And why do you think that is?
Money, status, and just the toxic relationship between an abusive oppressor and those that they oppress. Like any toxic or abusive relationship, people are often baffled and astounded by the extremes that the people that are abused will go through to not only protect, but to remain around the people that oppress them. It happens every day. Somebody abuses somebody, and the last person to wake up and see that they shouldn't be around that person is the person they're abusing most directly. So other people would say, hey, you might as well do your own thing. If this was me after 246 years of slavery, I would have no interest in ever being around these people. So it'd be baffling to somebody from the outside who wasn't part of this toxic abusive relationship to understand, why would you even want to sit there? Why would you even want to drink? Why would you even want to be? What is the logic? But when you look at trauma and you look at abusive relationships, you say, oh, this makes perfect sense. This is somebody who's been abused for generations. They've been bred, they've been exploited, they've been raped, they've been beaten, they've been mutilated, they've been lynched, they've been incarcerated, they've been maligned, they've been mischaracterized, they've been described as 3/5 of a human being. So after all of this trauma, without any treatment, without any debriefing, without any type of therapy, you discover some psychoses. And one of them is, regardless of how bad you treat me, I want to be around you. Elijah Muhammad said that they love the devil because the devil gives them nothing. I think that speaks to what Dr. Molefi Kete-Sante calls dislocation. When the process of slave breaking removed our idea of God and our concept of spirituality, removed our language, not using our drum, not dressing in our traditional clothes, not enjoying our culture, not enjoying our foods, not enjoying our own names. Literally, a name denotes ownership. So when you leave and you have the name of the people that owned you, there's a lot of issues that are going to occur from those realities. When you have been separated from all that you are and have ever been, and it's been replaced not only by some arbitrary force or influence, but by the very influence that destroyed you. The very people that raped your grandmothers and grandfathers and bred them like cattle are the ones who gave you your name and your way of thinking. So if you ever seen a movie, a black exploitation movie, where the cop comes on the block and he says, all you ladies can go home. I'm going to lock the pimp up. Who's the first one to protect him? It's not a stranger. It's the same ladies he'd been beating up and exploiting the whole movie. They're the ones that work all night and then go bring the pimp their money. The same way we do now with our tax dollars. Clean the white ladies' floors and then go give it to the same government that don't even let you vote. People are sick. But not to victim blame them. Justifiably traumatized. Justifiably sick. If there's a chance that I'll walk outside and see somebody hanging from a tree by the throat, and people are bragging about it and writing postcards about it and keeping souvenirs of these people's body parts and bringing their children in their Sunday best to witness a murder. Bring bringing children to witness murder and be so proud to take a picture, make a postcard, and send it to a family member. Run special buses and announce it in church. We're going to lynch somebody tomorrow. They're expecting 3,000 special buses will be running. The trains will. If this is the society we're in, you can't blame somebody born in this for being sick. Like Malcolm said, we don't blame the puppets. We blame the puppeteers. And I think that's why those civil rights leaders were so infected, because the disease permeated every aspect of society.
I'm aware of Derek Bell. Never met the gentleman, but I'm aware of his work.
Can you tell us a little bit about what you know about him?
Well, he was a professor at Harvard for one, but he was, I think one of the things he was known for was his work about his position on Brown versus Board of Education, and whether or not it would have been more advantageous had the case gone differently for the black community. He was making the case that, whereas in his opinion, Brown versus Board of Education dealt more with the separation issue versus the equal issue of the two, the case. And so he was making the case that had the African American community continued in its separate ways that it had prior to Brown v., but that equality of resources been brought to bear, that the African American community would have been better overall.
And how do you feel about that position?
I don't agree with it. I don't have a real feeling about it, but I don't agree with that in terms of the long view. I am old enough to remember segregation in that form, where black folk lived in the community, surrounded by itself, run by itself, controlled by itself. And it was nice. Don't get me wrong, it was nice. Desegregation expanded the opportunities, and it was a different. I think what really for me is, we did not have to give up what we had in our segregated communities to enjoy the fruits of an integrated community. I think we surrendered our community, our segregated, with the positive things in our segregated community, in order to be part of the integrated community. The negative effects of integration are from within the black community. It wasn't something that happened to the black community. It was something that the black community did, and not to itself, but around itself. In that the negative effects were, we lost identity. We did not push identity into the larger realm. We just left it, so to speak. We left the black experience and went on to something else, not knowing until much later that had we brought the black community with us, everything that the richness of the black community. Because if you've ever traveled in Europe and other places, you'll see, and even on the continent of Africa, you see places that have, you can go to a country in Africa and see a European influence. You can go to Europe and see an African influence. Well, America has an African influence, an African American influence. And so that's what I think I heard Dr. Bunch say in an interview once about the African American History Museum, is that it's an American museum, but it is from a different perspective. So it is America with an African influence. And that's what segregation sort of artificially broke for us. It says, it almost said you got to leave the African part of you and become the American, whereas every other culture brought their culture all the way through. We sort of stopped our culture in this false community that we had, instead of bringing it into the community as a whole and let it live off of its richness. Your identity is who you are as a people, as a person. Who you are, you can't leave who you are and go present yourself to someone else, and you can't even describe or explain who you are. So it was not necessary for us to do it. We did it.
From my understanding of Derek Bell, I mean, one of the contributions that he makes is to say, we need to get beyond this kind of liberal progressive narrative of Black inclusion as the solution to all our problems. So he's very critical of, I would say, more liberal civil rights initiatives that focus on primarily citizenship rights, like voting rights, and the focus as well on desegregation, the focus on trying to gain inclusion into the United States rather than sort of understanding that not everything can be solved just through a matter of inclusion, that we actually need to critique the system in terms of how it works in the first place, and that the goal is not necessarily inclusion, but it's also a question of equity. Well, for me, I'm very critical of the liberal progress narrative. Every class that I teach is sort of going against that narrative, that we've, went through the really bad times and then sort of made it into this, apex of triumph with the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act. Because for me, that actually doesn't answer questions about why we continue to have racial disparities in education, housing, every area, a marker of quality of life in the United States, and actually arguably abroad, right? This is a global question as well. So I'm always sort of pushing students to question, okay, what actually did people mean by freedom? What kinds of rights did folks want? And what were the myriad ways that people attempted to get those rights? I think for me, the question is not for or against. It's really about, do you subscribe to a liberal progress narrative? Right? That's one way of understanding Black politics. Or are you more for questions of equity, social justice, and systemic change? And that's where I fall. Regardless of whether or not I might agree or disagree on, the various more subtle points of his argument, I think that, the sort of liberal progressive narrative of, look at how far we've come, we've gotten all of these anti-discrimination laws passed, and yay, here we are. It doesn't help us to understand where we are at this moment. It doesn't help to explain mass incarceration and the rise of it. It doesn't help to explain the wealth gap in the United States vis-a-vis race. It doesn't help us to explain many things, like persistent segregation in housing, which has a lot to do with not just laws, but literally the value that we ascribe to whiteness. And so in that sense, I think what Derek Bell's work does is it forces us to confront those larger issues, which are actually a lot harder to solve than just passing legislation that says we should all be treated like some universal subject and have access to things, but not necessarily be guaranteed equitable resources.